Chapter 6, Class Struggle and the State, the Limits of Social Reform. Capital, the State, and the Reproduction of the Working Class. The subordination of society to the unfettered rule of money and law undermined the reproduction of the working class, individually and collectively. It's a big-ass crow. My goodness. While the expansion of capitalist enterprise created new opportunities and liberated the worker from the restraint of archaic social forms, the constant tendency to dispense with living labor by revolutionizing the means of production created an ever-growing surplus population as petty producers were destroyed and the redundant workers displaced. The individual form of the wage undermined the family and the household as the primary institution of social reproduction. The destruction of pre-capitalist social forms removed social barriers to the growth of population and destroyed institutions through which the old, the disabled, and the infirm could make a productive contribution and secure their means of subsistence. The destruction of traditional crafts and skills undermined the guilds and trade unions through which a section of the working class could retain an element of control of the conditions of its labor and maintain a living wage. The inevitable result of the advance of capital was the pauperization and demoralization of a growing mass of the population on a world scale. The working class did not reconcile itself to its fate without an intense and pervasive struggle. In the early stages of capitalist development, this struggle primarily took the form of a defense of the old corporate, cooperative, and paternalistic social institutions threatened with dissolution by the advancing power of capital, as these institutions were destroyed, and the reproduction of the working class was increasingly subordinated to the wage form. This struggle took on the dual form of a struggle of the wage laborers with the capitalists over the wage and the conditions of labor, which led to the growth of trade unions as the working class sought to mobilize its collective power and the demand of the pauperized for work or relief, a demand that came to be directed primarily at the state. These two aspects of the struggle were distinct, and so a potential source of division within the working class, as trade unions sought to overcome the barrier of competition from the surplus population. But these two aspects of the struggle were also closely related, and so provided a basis for solidarity, for the division of the working class between the employed and the pauperized For the division of the working class between the employed and the pauperized is neither rigid nor static. Poverty defines the condition of the vast majority of the employed working class, as the wage is insufficient to secure the physical and social reproduction of the household. Pauperism is a threat that hangs over the entire working class, as its prospective fate in the event of redundancy, injury, infirmity, or old age. The desperation of poverty undermines the solidarity of the working class, enabling the capitalists to force down the wages and intensify the labor of the employed. Capital enjoys a contradictory relation to the reproduction of the working class. As the accumulation of capital pauperizes and demoralizes the working class, accumulation undermines the foundations of the production and realization of surplus value. This contradiction appears in the interests of every individual capital in paying as low a wage and employing as few workers as possible, while other capitals pay high wages and provide plentiful employment to sustain a growing market. Similarly, every capital has an interest in minimizing the provision of public relief, which ultimately constitutes a drain on surplus value and weakens the disciplining force of the reserve army of labor, while at the same time having an interest in the reproduction of the reserve army as a body of potential wage laborers, and particularly for capitalists, producing means of consumption is an outlet for their surplus products. If the reserve army is growing fast and accumulation does not confront the barrier of the limited consumption of the domestic population, the former interest will predominate. If the appropriate qualities of labor power are becoming scarce and capital seeks to expand the domestic market, the latter interest of expanding the domestic market may come to the fore. However, in the last analysis, it is not the immediate interest of capital, but the social and political challenge of the working class that is the decisive factor. Although the reproduction of capital presupposes the reproduction of the working class, the state did not intervene to regulate working class reproduction at the behest of capitalists. Dude, I swear that motherfucker cut his grass like 3 days ago. Anyway, where am I? Although the reproduction of capital... Didn't that guy cut his grass like 3 days ago?
Yep.
Smells like fucking gasoline back here.
Unless he didn't finish it, I don't know.
Fucking people. Although the reproduction of capital presupposes the reproduction of the working class, the state did not intervene to regulate working class reproduction at the behest of capitalists, but in response to working class political pressure. However, the state could only respond to such pressures within the limits of its form. The immediate task of the state was to relieve distress in order to contain disorder. However, the state could not meet the aspirations of the working class for an adequate level of subsistence, for the state did not have the resources to meet such a demand, nor did the state have the power to guarantee employment. The central thrust of social reform was not to alleviate the condition of the working class directly, but to develop an increasingly complex and differentiated system of social administration that would ensure the working class could provide for its own needs through wage labor, social insurance, and family dependence, supplemented by a punitive and highly selective system of poor relief. Thus, the state responded to the challenge of the working class, not by subordinating social production to social need, but by developing an increasingly elaborate network of bureaucratic apparatuses to regulate the physical and social aspirations of the working class as a class of wage laborers for capital. Social reform undoubtedly improved the conditions of the working class and to that extent represented a material advance. However, social reform also involved the growth of a centralized and bureaucratic system of social administration, increasingly insulated from democratic control, through which the state sought, against determined and persistent working class resistance, to enforce the systematic subordination of the working class to the wage form and of women to family dependence. Pauperism and the state. The erosion of the personal relations of feudal authority had led to the Elizabethan Poor Law, which lay at the heart of a complex web of protective legislation that gave legal sanction and fiscal authority to the detailed regulation of the reproduction of the working class by the local gentry, who, in their capacity as justices of the peace, could regulate the terms and conditions of labor and the prices of essential commodities, subsidize wages, provide relief, and maintain order by administering the criminal law and calling on the military. The old poor law was based on pre-capitalist forms of labor. The old poor law was based on the pre-capitalist forms of labor, in which few were wholly dependent on the wage, most of the population struggling to survive on a combination of subsistence production, wage labor, and petty commodity production, within social relations that retained strong communal and patriarchal elements. The generalization of capitalist production destroyed the social and economic foundations of these transitional forms of production. As the social relations of authority and dependence were eroded, and the mass of the population was forced into reliance on an inadequate wage, the forms of regulation associated with the old poor law broke down under the pressure of the escalating cost of relief and popular resistance. Despite the faith of political economy in the moralizing and disciplining force of the wage form, the state could not simply dismantle the apparatus of relief, repression, and moral regulation of the old poor law. The state rather had to reform the system of regulation to make the system of regulation more adequate to the wage form. The new poor law lay the foundation for the subsequent development of the, quote, social administration of the working class by the state. The principal features of this reform were the The principal features of this reform were the replacement of a discretionary and comprehensive system of regulation based on the social relations of the local community by a uniform and differentiated system of regulation based on administrative and legal relations. Thus, the justices were bypassed by the establishment of locally elected guardians, supervised by a central board, while the scope of the poor law was narrowed to the powers to regulate the terms and conditions of labor, to subsidize wages, and to control prices were finally abolished. The guardian's responsibilities being confined to the relief, disciplining, and moral education of the destitute. Meanwhile, the justices retained the responsibility for the criminal law, and the militia were gradually replaced by the development of a specialized and permanent police force. The new poor law and the police provided the disciplinary reinforcement of the wage form, and the revival of religion and the spread of education provided a moralizing force. For the abolition of outdoor relief removed the responsibility of the poor law for the subsistence and direct regulation of the waged and the petty commodity producers. But the abolition of outdoor relief removed the responsibility of the poor law for the subsistence and direct regulation of the waged and of the petty commodity producers. The removal of the wage from the purview of the poor laws was not determined only by the desire to reduce the cost of relief, but also had an important political dimension, for the comprehensive form of the old poor law had played a major part in uniting and politicizing popular grievances, as the pauperized, the petty producers, and the wage laborers confronted the undifferentiated authority of the justices. The functional differentiation of the repressive and regulatory apparatus of the state undermined this unity. The functional differentiation of the repressive and regulatory apparatus of the state undermined this unity by fragmenting the grievances of the mass of the population, making possible differentiated political responses that serve to reproduce and exaggerate divisions within the working class. The withdrawal of the state from direct responsibility for the regulation of the wage relation was particularly important, since it detached the state from direct involvement in the immediate struggles of wage laborers. The repeal of the Combination Acts were an important anticipation of the reform of the poor law in this respect. Although trade unions were still subject to the full force of the civil and criminal law, which brought effective trade unionism into direct confrontation with the state. The reform of the poor law presupposed the generalization of wage labor and of the adequacy of the wage to secure the reproduction of the employed and their dependents. Until these conditions were realized, the poor law remained under severe pressure, and the implementation of the reform met fierce resistance. The generalization of wage labor was largely achieved by the massive destruction of petty production in the Depression of the 1840s and the expansion of wage labor in the mid-Victorian boom. On the other hand, the pressure of surplus population enabled employers to hold down wages so that the bulk of wage laborers could barely support themselves, let alone the wives and children whom male laborers were required by law to maintain. Many men abandoned their families to the poor law while they went in search of work. Pressure of poverty undermined wider kinship and community relations, the sick, the elderly, and the infirm, or the destitute being taken into the workhouse under the poor law, while forcing women and children to work long hours for meager wages to maintain the immediate family, and all workers to accept dangerous and unhealthy working conditions, leading to further demands on the poor law from the sick, the injured, and the exhausted. Thus, the demands on the poor law were not reduced by reform. The demands on the poor law continued to escalate. The guardians responded to these pressures by developing an increasingly differentiated system of administration that sought to deal with the different moral issues raised by the various forms of poverty, and to prevent the moral contamination of one form of dereliction by another. Thus, the workhouse separated the insane, the elderly, the young, the infirm, and the able-bodied, and spawned a series of differentiated institutions. The guardians attempted to prevent the poor from falling back entirely on the poor law by continuing to dispense outdoor relief, their efforts increasingly supplemented by private charity. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted Meanwhile, pressure mounted from the poor law authorities, from humanitarians, and from the trade unions for public health measures to reduce the incidence of disease, for legislation to restrict child and female labor, which it was hoped would strengthen the family and the working class morality and help to raise male wages, and factory inspection to reduce the incidence of industrial injuries. The efforts of evangelism and education to strengthen the family were in vain, while male wages were too low to support the family, and this led to a more favorable view of trade unions, the generalization of which, it was hoped, would secure greater uniformity of wages and working conditions, improving the lot of the most exploited workers at the expense of the better paid. It was not until the brutal defeat of Chartism and the social peace and growing prosperity of the mid-Victorian boom that the implementation of the new poor law and the subordination of the working class to the wage form was more or less complete in England. While the poor law administration categorized, inspected, educated, disciplined, and degraded those who fell within its clutches, the working class made every effort to avoid the humiliation of official pauperism. Trade unions and friendly societies provided benefits to members in the event of sickness, unemployment, or old age, although only the best paid workers could afford to cover themselves for the full range of benefits, the less fortunate falling back on private charity rather than public relief. Nevertheless, the hope that the moralizing and disciplining effect of the new poor law would be sufficient to eliminate poverty was far from being realized. Political reform and social administration. By the 1860s, the industrial growth had provided employment opportunities for impoverished agricultural laborers and displaced domestic producers, but industrial growth had not in general led to rising wages. Mass and persistent pauperism, mainly in the rural districts, that had been the main form of poverty in the first half of the century, gave way in mainland Britain to urban pauperism that affected not only the old, demoralized, or infirm, who lacked the skills and physical capacities required for industrial employment, but also extended, particularly in London, to large numbers of unskilled, casual, and sweated laborers, leading to a rapid increase in the cost of the poor law, despite the enormous growth of private charity. The problem was not simply that of cost, but of the fear that the liberal dispensation of relief was reinforcing the demoralization of the poor, undermining the rule of law and the subordination of the working class to the wage form. The problem of pauperism continued to be seen by the ruling class primarily as a moral problem. The, quote, residuum was seen as a pool of degraded humanity, breeding criminality, prostitution, disease, and degeneration that could threaten the moral and physical health of the population as a whole, as demoralization spread to the employed working class, a fear that grew with renewed working class political agitation from the 1860s. However, it was not poverty that caused the moral degradation of the residuum, but rather its moral failings that were the cause of its poverty. Moral failings that had been encouraged by the indiscriminate dispensation of charity that have replaced outdoor relief. The solution to the problem was therefore to strengthen the stick of the poor law, while bringing the carrot of private charity under closer control to ensure that provision was made not as a right, but only for deserving cases, and as a means of encouraging the development of self-reliance. This was the basis on which the Charity Organization Society was established in 1869, and later, the basis on which charitable housing was provided. The provision of relief and subsidized housing being accompanied by the systematic organization of charitable visiting and rent collection as instruments of moral education and reinforcement of the family form. The resurgence of working-class political agitation from the 1860s raised the question not only of the regulation of the poor, but also of the employed working class. Although the state had expected the repeal of the Combinations Act to separate trade unionism from political agitation, such an expectation was naive, for while trade union activity was subject to the civil law of contract and criminal law of conspiracy, effective trade unionism inevitably brought not only individual workers, but the trade unions themselves into conflict with the law. Moreover, the peculiar form of the wage relation meant that the law of contract was extremely one-sided. Although the law defined the wage bargain as a freely entered contract, the peculiar character of the commodity labor power meant that the terms of the contract could not be precisely codified into law. As far as the trade unions were concerned, the employer had a duty to pay customary wage rates and to recognize established job demarcations, apprenticeship regulations, and manning levels. However, even if the trade union was able to secure the agreement of the employer to recognize the established rights of the trade, there was no way of giving this agreement the force of law. Under the master and servant laws, the wage contract was an individual bargain in which the worker submitted himself to the direction of the capitalist. There was nothing to stop the capitalist from employing labor below trade union rates and from importing blacklegs in event of a strike. Should trade unionists try to enforce their rights by imposing solidarity, they stood liable to meet the full force of the civil and criminal law. Thus, trade union activity brought the organized working class increasingly into a conflict with a class law, and behind that law with the state. These issues came to a head as employers sought to attack the rights of skilled workers from the 1850s. As the unions came up against the force of the law, they began to agitate for the reform of the franchise as the means of securing their rights through legal reform. The reform agitation grew increasingly militant as the urban poor combined with the organized working class and the urban petty bourgeoisie. However, the demands of the organized working class were more limited than had been the demands of Chartism, while the state was better equipped to accommodate them than it had been 20 years earlier. Thus the state responded not with intensified repression, but with reform, attempting to divide the skilled working class that was undoubtedly beginning to enjoy the fruits of capitalist prosperity from the class as a whole, and to confine working class activity to constitutional channels by separating the unavoidably class-based demands of trade unionism from the political aspirations of the working class. The reform of 1867 extended the franchise to the men of the skilled working class and urban petty bourgeoisie. The trade union legislation that followed did not codify trade union rights, but the trade union legislation did provide limited legal immunities that made it possible for trade unions to organize, to strike, and to picket peacefully, although not to enforce their solidarity without confronting the law. Like the 1832 Reform Bill, that of 1867 had little immediate impact on the class composition of the House of Commons or the alignments of political forces. The franchise still embraced less than 15% of the population over the age of 20, although it was further extended to cover nearly 30% in 1884, providing little scope for independent labor representation. Moreover, as with the bourgeoisie following the 1832 reform, once the organized working class had achieved its constitutional ambitions and secured some recognition of its trade union rights, the main political issues of the day were not class issues, nor did the trade union's immediate concerns dictate a class perspective. The working class was admitted to the Constitution not on the basis of class, but of citizenship. Once the wages issue was settled, the trade unions had as strong an interest as their employers in the prosperity of their particular branch of production. in minimizing the burden of taxation, in maintaining price stability, in conquering world markets, and in securing cheap supplies of imported food and raw materials. While some unions favored protective legislation and social insurance, others saw such paternalistic measures as a threat to trade unionism by undermining their collective defense of working conditions and collective provision for adversity. The framework within which these sectional differences were resolved was not that of the unity of the class, but the unity of the nation. The framework within which these sectional differences were resolved was not that of the unity of the class, but the unity of the nation, expressed in the common interest of all workers in growing prosperity and expanding employment opportunities, if necessary at the expense of the workers of other nations, which gave a political foundation to those chauvinistic and nationalist sentiments that the bourgeoisie had long tried to foster ideologically. The immediate significance of the extension of the franchise was that it strengthened the power of the national government rather than that of the working class, enabling it to pursue the task of centralizing and rationalizing the system of public administration, although its efforts met with determined resistance, at first from local vested interest and later from democratically elected local bodies. The 1867 Reform Bill was followed by a wave of reforming legislation, most notably the 1870 Education Act and the Public Health and Housing Acts of 1875. These reforms were not seen as much as a means of ameliorating the conditions of the working class as of encouraging the working class to help itself, reflecting a belief that grew steadily over the last decades of the century that environmental conditions were as much a cause as a consequence of pauperism. So that the improvement of sanitation and of housing was as much a moralizing force as were education and charitable provision. The initial wave of legislation was concerned to rationalize existing provision, which had largely been a matter for local initiative rather than marking a new departure. The proliferation of local bodies, the ineffectiveness of judicial supervision of public administration, and the marked disparity of performance between different local authorities increased the pressure on central government to play a more active role in initiating social reform and in directing social reform's administration, while the extension of the franchise both increased the electoral pressure on the government to act and provided it with the means to undermine resistance from local vested interest, whose intransigence threatened to provoke deepening class conflict. On the other hand, the reform of government finances in the 1860s provided the regular systems of accounting and financial control that enabled the government to mobilize its resources more effectively, while the reform of the civil service provided it with the means of developing systems of bureaucratic regulation. Thus, the extension of the franchise provided the political basis on which the state could eliminate the power of local vested interest and rationalize the system of social administration within the framework of the capitalist state form. The proliferation of local administrative bodies was ended with the establishment of multi-purpose elected local authorities that took over their duties. This development provided local government bodies that had the administrative and financial resources to undertake more ambitious programs and that were much more responsive to political pressure for social reform. Hi, Mommy.
Hello. Where's Dad?
I'm not sure. Thus, the development of such authorities was soon followed by the rapid growth of expenditure on education and public health, and the municipalization of gas, water, and electricity from the late 19th century, followed by the growth in expenditure on public assistance, and to a limited extent housing at the beginning of the 20th century. This expansion was far greater than could be financed by local resources. The development of specific exchequer grants to local authorities, starting with education, progressively reduced the dependence of local authorities on rate revenues, and simultaneously brought them under increasing central government control. Crisis of 1873 and the Great Depression. The sustained accumulation of the mid-Victorian boom enabled the state to contain the class struggle by a judicious combination of repression and legal and administrative reform, while making few substantive concessions to the aspirations of the working class. Periods of depression were brief, as crises were soon followed by fairly rapid, if uneven, recovery, so that mass unrest did not escalate to the stage of class confrontation, nor precipitate a serious political crisis. Thus, the reform agitation could be safely accommodated by the limited extension of the franchise and the demands of the trade unions by the grants of limited immunities. However, this situation was not to last for much longer, for the form of accumulation on a world scale through which Britain had prospered reached its limits in the world crisis of overaccumulation of 1873. In the first half of the 19th century, the overaccumulation of capital in manufacturing had been reconciled with the limited consumption power of the mass of the population and the technological backwardness of agriculture, primarily by the destruction of petty commodity producers and the extension of the margin of cultivation on a world scale. The overproduction of manufactured goods led to falling prices, but falling prices stimulated continuing improvements in productivity that sustained profits, while rising prices of raw materials stimulated the search for new sources of supply. The possibilities for sustaining accumulation on this basis soon confronted the barrier of the cost of transport. As overaccumulation in manufacturing came up against the barrier of the market in the 1840s, the Depression was communicated worldwide. Profits were squeezed, petty producers swept aside, and class conflict intensified, culminating in the revolutions of 1848. However, the barrier of the limited market was overcome by the massive investment in the means of transport, above all railways, which lifted the world economy out of the Depression and carried it forward into the mid-Victorian boom. The mid-Victorian boom was dominated by railway investment. Productivity in manufacturing grew only slowly, but accumulation was sustained by the massive reduction in transport costs that opened up new sources of food and raw materials, despite the continued technological backwardness of agriculture, and expanded the market for manufacturing despite the limited consumption power of the mass of the population. Accumulation did not proceed smoothly, but only through the mechanism of overaccumulation and crisis. Until the 1840s, crises were not usually a sign that accumulation had reached accumulation's limits, but were merely temporary setbacks, often exaggerated by the weaknesses of a financial system in which the expansion of bank credit was virtually uncontrolled, and which was vulnerable to collapse in the face of relatively small financial shocks caused by harvest failures or the temporary closure of markets or by speculative collapses. In the crisis, it was primarily petty producers and commercial and financial capitalists who failed, while productive capitalists who carried little debt largely survived. Accumulation would then be resumed once the financial crisis had stabilized and credit again became available. By the 1850s, the international financial system had become more sophisticated and rather more robust. The City of London had become the world's financial center, financing much of the world's trade and the investment flows, and providing the ultimate source of liquidity for the world banking system. Thus, the Bank of England was provided the funds that sustained accumulation on a world scale. However, railway promotions, with their opportunities for fraud, stimulated overaccumulation on an unprecedented scale, and crises were typically precipitated by the failure of railway promotions. Nevertheless, the devaluation of railway investments left the railways in place, the reduction in transport costs stimulating renewed accumulation, which was driven forward by a further wave of railway construction and promotion. The crisis of 1873 revealed the limits of this form of accumulation. The penetration of the more populous regions of the world by the railways was more or less complete. The extent of fraudulent and speculative promotions revealed by the crisis, the proliferation of unprofitable railways, and the more conservative lending policies of the banks that survived the crash meant that there was no basis for a new promotional boom in the wake of the crisis. On the other hand, the domestic sources of recovery were still restricted by the limited consumption power of the mass of the population, even though falling food prices led to rising living standards. The bulk of working class incomes was devoted to food, clothing, and housing, providing a stimulus to the development of agriculture, construction, and public utilities, but little direct demand for the products of factory industry beyond the traditional textile industry. Thus, the renewed accumulation of capital on the basis of the revolutionizing of the forces of production constantly came up against the barrier of the limited market. Having overcome the external natural and social barriers to accumulation, with the extension of the railways and the elimination of petty production, the further development of the forces of production came up against the barrier of the capitalist social relations of production, leading to intensified competition between capitalists. Intensified competition, in turn, stimulated the further development of the forces of production and the further overaccumulation of capital, leading to growing pressure on profits, the devaluation of capital, and the destruction of productive capacity. From 1873, the barrier to accumulation of capital had become capital itself. The crisis of 1873, which broke with the collapse of a railway investment boom in Central Europe and the United States, soon spread worldwide. The immediate impact of the crisis in Britain was not as dramatic as had been that of previous crises. For the first time, the Bank of England was able to weather an international financial crisis without major bank failures and without having to suspend the Bank Act. However, the impact of the crisis overseas was more severe. The emergence of massive overproduction, particularly in coal, iron, steel, and textiles, in the wake of the crisis of 1873, threatened to destroy newly developed industries, particularly in Germany and the United States, where capitalists carried the high fixed costs of recent investment, much of which had been financed by borrowing and enjoyed only limited access to world markets. The reduction in the demand for food and raw materials, together with the increased supply as newly opened territories came into production, extended the crisis to agriculture, prices being supported in the middle of the decade only by a series of bad European harvests. Although the British financial system had survived the crisis, its depressive impact on Britain's markets was soon felt in intensified competition, which pressed hard on profits. However, the British commercial and manufacturing system was well adapted to absorbing such shocks. British manufacturers carried little debt, had a large home market, and diversified foreign markets at their command, access to those markets being secured by British commercial and financial supremacy. Capitalist agriculture was already well developed in England, though not in Ireland, and the main victims were landowners who faced falling rents, while farmers were able to diversify into the production of meat and vegetables. In the US and continental Europe, the destruction of capacity and the restructuring of capital in the crisis provided the basis for domestic recovery, but in Britain, much less capacity was liquidated, while the relative stagnation of world trade and investment removed the traditional bases of recovery, so that the period from 1873 to 1896 came to be known as the Great Depression. Depression, industrial relations, and social insurance. Although the Depression was not as severe in Britain as elsewhere, the Depression was more persistent. British manufacturers responded to the Depression in their well-tried ways, cutting back production levels and accepting lower prices and profits without incurring the cost of developing and applying new methods of production, and without significant changes in business organization, in the expectation that commercial capitalists would soon open up new markets. However, the failure of new markets to materialize meant that the brief spurts of recovery were soon checked until new forces could emerge to stimulate the renewal of accumulation on a world scale. When the world boom began to gather pace, unevenly at first, from the end of the century, Britain was dragged along with it. Although productivity continued to stagnate, domestic industrial profits were by no means spectacular, and rising food prices steadily eroded real wages. The period was not one of uniform depression, but of brief periods of recovery that were checked as accumulation came up against the barrier of the limited market, and of considerable unevenness in the fate of the various branches of production. Prices, profits, and unemployment rose and fell, both in a trend of generally falling prices, low profits, and relatively high unemployment. This was the context in which the class struggle developed in and against the constitutional framework provided by the trade unions and electoral reforms. Trade unionism intended to follow the course of the cycle, with unions thriving in the boom and being weakened or destroyed as the employers sought to reduce wages in the Depression. However, the long boom had provided a favorable context for the growth and consolidation of skilled trade unions. Although fluctuations in the fortunes of their employers still provoked sharp conflicts and many setbacks. At first, the Great Depression was no different from previous periods of difficulty, as employers sought to force down wages. However, the persistence of price instability within a falling trend meant that such disputes proved very costly, both to the trade unions and the employers, while competitive wage cutting intensified conflicts with the unions and competition among employers. The fall in food prices from the end of the 1870s provided this context within which trade unions were prepared to negotiate wage cuts for their members as the price of industrial peace. There was therefore a rapid development of mechanisms for negotiation, conciliation, and arbitration from the 1880s that provided constitutional channels for the regulation of industrial relations, allowing for the adjustment of wages without costly strikes. The state shared the interest of trade unions and employers in the institutionalization of the wage relation within a stable industrial relations framework, which established the uniformity and stability of wages, with disputes being resolved by negotiation rather than through strike action, which brought the trade unions inevitably into confrontation with the state. Thus, the state played an increasingly active role from the middle of the 1890s in encouraging the growth of industrial relations and in sponsoring negotiation and arbitration when industrial relations broke down. Persistent depression and limitations of sectional trade unionism encouraged the growth of socialism in the 1880s, the socialists playing a leading role in the unemployed agitation in the depression of the middle of the decade and the spectacular growth of the new unionism of the less skilled workers at the end of the decade. Although unskilled unionism was largely destroyed in the subsequent slump, the unemployed agitation aroused considerable anxiety on the part of the state and focused attention on the, quote, problem of unemployment, of the unemployed. Although unskilled unionism was largely destroyed in the subsequent slump, the unemployed agitation aroused considerable anxiety on the part of the state and focused attention on the, quote, problem of the unemployed. The political fear, realized in unruly demonstrations in London in 1886 and 1887, was that the trade unions and the unemployed would join forces with the pauperized residuum to present a serious threat to public order, which the socialists would convert into a threat to the Constitution. This fear was expressed in a concern that the employed working class would be morally contaminated by contact with the residuum if the employed working class fell back on the poor law. This concern led to the provision of relief for the cyclically unemployed outside the poor law, and later underlay the development of social insurance, distinct from the poor law, to deal with the problems of cyclical unemployment, sickness, and old age. As the locus of working class agitation shifted from London to the industrial districts, the immediate political threat of the urban poor waned. On the other hand, the humiliation of the poor law and the degradation of the workhouse threatened the whole working class in periods of sickness, unemployment, and old age, providing a basis for class unity and a recruiting ground for socialism. The hope that the employed will be able to support themselves in adversity by taking out private or cooperative insurance was unrealistic when low pay was widespread, bouts of cyclical unemployment more frequent, and wages falling from the turn of the century. This led to a new approach to the problem of poverty on the part of the state. On the one hand, the problem of chronic pauperism was distinguished from that of the residuum, poverty being seen primarily as a problem of low pay and casual labor. In an attempt to deal with the problem and relieve the poor law, the state established the trade boards to regulate industrial relations in industries where trade unionism was undeveloped and inserted fair wage clauses in public contracts. On the other hand, the state established a compulsory state-administered scheme of sickness and unemployment insurance, financed by employers, workers, and the state, and introduced old age pensions, which freed growing numbers of workers from the harshness of the poor law. The limits of social reform. The reform of trade unions and industrial legislation, the growth of public expenditure on health, education, and housing, the provision of social insurance, and the alleviation of the harshness of the poor law all represented limited concessions to the aspirations of the working class, expressed both through the electoral system and through extra-parliamentary agitation. Although such reforms did not necessarily conflict with the interest of capital, the important point is that they reflected an increasingly explicit recognition that capital, through the rule of money and the law, could not secure the physical, moral, and social reproduction of the working class, which had therefore to be secured through collective provision. However, the socialization of the reproduction of the working class through social administration, social insurance, and the system of industrial relations was circumscribed by the continued subordination of the individual worker to the wage form and of women within the family form. This meant that the working class had no unqualified right to subsistence. Such a right could only be earned by hard labor and regular insurance contributions or by female dependence. But the working class had no right to work either. Thus, a growing proportion of the population was disqualified from a right to subsistence, not because they were unwilling to make a productive contribution to society, but because capital could not provide them with the opportunity to make such a contribution within the wage form. Denied the right to work, the worker had to submit to degrading inspection and supervision to qualify for support, proving eligibility on the grounds of sickness, insanity, old age, or disability. Women and children could only secure subsistence if they could prove that there was no man who could be compelled to support them. Able-bodied men could only secure subsistence by submitting their willingness to work to the, quote, workhouse test, end quote. The low-paid were disqualified from relief by the principle of, quote, less eligibility. The limits of social reform were not simply a reflection of the political power of capital, but more fundamentally reflected the limits of the capitalist state form. The state had no power to grant a right to work, nor the resources to provide large-scale employment or indiscriminate relief. Even the limited scale of provision imposed a heavy burden of taxation by contemporary standards. The financing of the Edwardian social insurance system provoked a constitutional crisis. The only way the state could hope to relieve poverty was by encouraging the absorption of the poor into wage labor and seeking to eliminate casual and sweated labor. Thus, the essential thrust of social reforms from the 1870s was not to relieve want through more generous public provision, but rather to develop forms of regulation that would increase the ability and obligation of workers to make provision for their own subsistence needs on the basis of the wage form, a possibility that became more realistic with the general rise in wages during the Great Depression. The development of trade unionism and collective bargaining, and later wage boards, minimum wage legislation, and the increased level of benefit for the unemployed provided a means of securing a living wage for those in work. The strengthening of the family through moral and religious exhortation, through legal and administrative regulation, through the provision of housing, welfare services, and medical inspection, strengthened the obligation on able-bodied adults to support their family members. The extension of public education sought to provide the working class with the social, moral, and technical skills required for wage labor. The working class was encouraged and later compelled to make provision for for the cyclical problems of unemployment, sickness, and old age through insurance. The functional differentiation of the poor law focused its punitive thrust on the able-bodied poor. Thus, the state responded to the struggle of the working class to secure its individual and social reproduction by developing a system of social reform in which the working class was the object of an increasingly complex web of regulation, inspection, and supervision that sought to reconcile the physical reproduction of the worker with the subordination of the working class to the perceived needs of capital. The working class enjoyed a contradictory relation to the apparatus of social reform. On the one hand, the apparatus of social reform improved the ability of the working class family to reproduce itself, at least at a minimal level of subsistence, and even to improve its condition. On the other hand, the apparatus only provided support on the basis of the subordination of the worker to the power of capital through the wage form and the state through the form of social administration. The working class did not accept that accidents of birth or fortune should condemn the worker to subordination to the power of capital or to the agencies of the state. While the working class accepted the wage, poor relief, sickness, or unemployment benefit, the working class did not accept the price it was asked to pay for its meager subsistence. However generous the scale of public provision, and however high the wage, the working class constantly resented and resisted the forms through which the working class secured its subsistence, challenging and confronting the power of capital in the state and the alienated forms of public provision. Working class resistance appeared spontaneously in workers' everyday relations with capital and the state. Trade unionism provided the working class with a basis on which to develop the working class's collective strength, the vote with a basis on which to pursue the struggle for the democratization of public administration, and socialism an ideology within which to formulate the working class's collective aspirations. The state could not countenance the attempt of the working class to challenge its constitutional authority by mobilizing this collective strength in support of its aspirations, but sought to confine working class struggles within the constitutional framework provided for it through a dual strategy of repression and concession. The constitutional framework of working class representation was embodied in the dual forms of industrial relations and parliamentary representation. The expression of working class aspirations through the fragmented form of industrial relations and electoral politics confine these aspirations within the dual forms of capital's power, the state and the wage relation, and concessions to the working class were made primarily to contain the working class's struggles within those channels, reaffirming the working class's continued subordination to capital. However, the wage form and the state form equally set limits to the ability of capital and the state to respond to the aspirations of the working class by providing higher wages, employment, and welfare benefits. When the aspirations of the working class threatened to press beyond those limits, the working class struggle could no longer be confined within the constitutional forms provided for it. Industrial relations provided an appropriate framework for the trade unions to express working class aspirations within the wage form. Parliamentary representation provided an appropriate channel for trade unions to seek the reform of the law and for Fabian socialists to pursue their demands for radical social reform. However, constitutional trade unionism and constitutional politics were unable to secure stable wages, guarantee employment, adequate housing, education, and welfare benefits, and above all were unable to challenge the everyday subordination of the working class to the economic and political power of capital. Such organizational and political forms did not appear very promising to the rank-and-file movement that took root in the boom immediately preceding the First World War, which was increasingly attracted to the class politics of direct action socialism that sought workers' control on the basis of industrial unionism. While the former could be accommodated by the state, the latter, direct action socialism, was fiercely resisted in the name not of the power of capital, but of the defense of the Constitution. However, the confrontation with the state was postponed by the outbreak of war when the state mobilized its last and most powerful weapon, national chauvinism. The limits of social reform were set by the limits of the liberal state form. Social reform could attempt to reconcile the reproduction of the working class with its subordination to the wage form, but it could not provide jobs for the unemployed nor adequate wages for those in work. The rise of social reform was accompanied by a growing concern of the state with the issue of national prosperity, rising wages, and the growth of employment. This concern was partly in response to growing political pressures, but also in response to the financial pressures arising from the cost of social reform and poor relief. The barriers to sustained accumulation no longer appeared as the physical barriers of limited productive capacity, nor as the natural barriers of transport difficulties, nor as the social barrier of the resistance of the working class. The barrier to accumulation was now capital itself, a barrier that appeared in the growing pressure of international competition, which was the result of the overaccumulation of capital on a world scale. The attempt of the nation state to secure the sustained accumulation of domestic productive capital in the face of such competition brought to the fore the contradiction between the global character of accumulation and the national form of the state, as the intervention of nation-states politicized the competitive struggle, presented new barriers to accumulation, and eventually degenerated into inter-imperialist war.